Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special evening for EBTS and talking to Paul Bangay. Paul is a leading Australian garden designer and international garden designer, and apart from his gardens in Australia, he has designed in the USA, in Los Angeles, and in the Hamptons, in New Zealand, south of France, and in the UK. His gardens have been described quite correctly as highly structured, superbly proportioned, and executed always to the highest standards. And they always are places of great beauty. He has a very high profile, apart from his design, with his books. He produced his first book about 25 years ago, and they are regularly now produced about every 2 years, and we'll come to those a bit later. In 2001, he was awarded the Centenary Medal for his contribution to garden landscape design. And in 2018, he was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for his contribution to garden design. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning. Good evening for you.
Yes, absolutely. I was going to start with asking you, what is the weather like? Well, I think we've been through all of that. You haven't got a great day there for the moment, but your equivalent there is sort of early April, isn't it, to us?
Yes, probably.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
it's sort of mid-spring now, and
Yes.
you know, everyone would have known from last year how bad Australia was during the summer with our terrible fires and heat and drought. But this year we've got something called La Nina, which I don't know whether you know about in the Northern Hemisphere, but it means wet conditions for the whole of spring and summer and slightly milder temperature. So we're all very excited for La Nina to be here.
Oh, good. That's excellent. Now, straight into gardening, how would we recognize a Paul Bangay garden?
I'd like to think that, you know, the one word that I like to associate with them is timeless. A lot of garden designers do sort of very fashionable gardens, sort of very fad gardens, but I like to make mine endure. So classic inspired, still using contemporary materials, but and recreationally contemporary in the way we live, but sort of very sort of classic, well proportioned, like you said, you know, good sense of scale and enduring. So I think that's probably how we would recognize them.
And in terms of planting, how would we recognize them?
Well, so it's evolving all the time. Like, you know, my gardens used to be very formal, very structured, very clipped, a lot of topiary, and it's softening now. So, you know, I think as you grow older and mature a little bit, your styles certainly do evolve, and it is softening now. So the planting schemes are definitely changing, and we are becoming a little wild, or we are becoming a little more informal in terms of the planting. So we use lots of perennials now. We use lots of roses, still use lots of roses, lots of Mediterranean plants, especially for Australia, because they suit our climate. Still with a formal background to it. So still, you know, with hedging in it. So this lovely mix of sort of formal hedging and softer perennial planting.
Excellent. But how did it all start? When did you start gardening?
Look, from a very, very early age, my mother was a mad keen gardener, and she was very active in the Australian native plant movement. And we had a wonderful farm down at Wilson's Promontory, which is the lowest, most southern point of mainland Australia. And there she created this sort of very wonderful, wild, natural garden. So from a very early age, we were out in the garden working with her, being encouraged by her to appreciate gardens and love gardens. And we all had our own little patch in the family garden. So I loved mine, and it went from a very simple flower garden to a very elaborate glass house and rockery and fountains, and it kept changing all the time. And my father just said to me one time, he said, "Can we just let the garden be for a little while instead of changing it all the time?" But I think that's where my love of garden design started, because I was always wanting to, you know, look at books and see what was happening overseas, and always adapting and changing this garden. So very, very early on in my childhood, I developed this appreciation and love of gardens.
So that's how that translated into you being a designer. But you did get an award, didn't you, to travel overseas to look at gardens?
I did. My father was a vice chancellor. He was vice chancellor of a big university in Melbourne. And so he said, you've got to study. So I got the academic side from my father and my love of beauty and gardens from my mother. So it was a great mix because I went to Melbourne University and studied landscape design there. So that was wonderful. Then I opened a little nursery in Melbourne, and that was a great way of showcasing my designs. So, you know, you come out of university, you're a young kid, no one knows of you. So I went and opened this nursery, landscaped the whole back of it, and made it like an Italian courtyard, and everyone just fell in love with it. And that is how I really started my design career and got well known. But I got awarded a traveling scholarship by the Arts Centre in Melbourne, and that was just a turning point for me. It was just fantastic. So I was able to travel around the world wherever I wanted for 6 months and shadow other designers. So, you know, just work with designers in each country. I went to America, South America, and Europe, and just really followed designers around. It might have been for a week, might have been for a day, but just saw what they were doing. And also went to visit the great gardens of the world. So it was an amazing experience.
That sounds absolutely. When you went to South America, did you meet Burle Marx?
So this is a funny story. Well, it's not so funny really. I had an appointment to go meet him. So I'd organized this. It took a long time to organize this. And I was in Florida on my way down, and he died the day before I got there.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So
Yes.
I was so excited to meet him and go out to his garden, but sadly I didn't get to do it.
But did you see any of his gardens when you were there?
I did, yes. I went to Brasilia and saw some of his public works, and of course in Rio I saw his, what he did to the foreshore there,
Yes.
which I just absolutely loved. I thought he was just inspirational.
Absolutely. Now, without going through every aspect of how you design a garden, can I just pick out elements within your design? And could we start with architecture? That's architecture, with, of course, with plants and with buildings.
Yes. So I think probably I'm a frustrated architect because that's the bit probably I love the most. And, you know, I take a lot of inspiration from the building itself. Rarely do you get to create a garden without a house or without a house there. So, you know, I really look to the architecture of the house and sort of extend that back out into the garden. So, you know, look at the form of the house, look at the style of the house, look at the period of the house, and translate that back into the garden. But also the shape of the garden, I find, largely follows from the house. So, you know, the width of the garden might be the width of the house, or the axes you create in the garden might be lining up with the front door, or sight lines within the house. And so that's what I call the architecture in the garden. And quite often I form that with hedges. You know, we use a lot of bay hedge in Australia. We use a lot of privet in Australia. We can't grow yew in Australia, sadly. There's a lot of Australian native plants we can use as hedges. But so that, you know, I create sort of like the rooms, if you like, that relate back to the architecture of the house. And that's what I'm calling the architecture in the garden. I also like lots of architectural elements, you know, creating sort of archways or gateways or pavilions or, you know, paving terraces and all those sort of architectural elements to the garden. I adore that. So that is my great love. So I think probably I am a frustrated architect as well.
And can you talk a little bit about scale? Because that's so important in garden design.
Well, it is, and you know, one thing Australia's not great at is scale. We're not used to it. It's a funny thing, but you know, so traveling overseas and traveling in Europe, where I think they do scale beautifully, is very important. And I do that twice a year. And being able to see, even if it's really big, grand gardens, you do get a wonderful sense of scale. And so I tend to slightly overscale everything because I think most amateurs, most people, where they go wrong is underscale things. They make paths a little too small. They make terraces too small. They make garden beds a little bit too narrow, make lawns too large. So what I like to do with scale is to overscale a little bit. And that just gives you this sort of lovely grandeur and feeling of space in a garden. So scale's very, very important to me.
And this also applies to very small gardens, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It definitely does. I mean, the smaller the garden, the more important scale is. You know, if you've got a small garden and you clutter it with a whole lot of small things, it doesn't look nearly as good as if you took one big dramatic element in that garden, maybe with a mirror behind it and a decent sized terrace and then plant around it. You know, overscaling a small garden is even more important than a big garden.
Absolutely. And one of the beautiful things about your gardens is the detailing. You're very precise in how you get your finishes. You're very particular about that.
Yes. I mean, that's just come from, I've been doing this for 30 years now, and just looking, I think craftsmanship is one of the most important things, finding good contractors who are great craftsmen has been very important to my career. But just looking at detailing all around the world, wherever I go traveling, I have a little pad and I have a little tape measure, and I just measure, how big their steel edging is, how wide the paths are, what's the differential between the path and the garden beds or a lawn. All those little things I look and note, and then bring that back to our design office in Melbourne. So detailing is critical, really is.
The other thing you need to know as a garden designer, of course, you have to study the climate and topography, and you're working in different countries. So how does that affect your approach?
Well, it does. I mean, you really have to, look at plants that are appropriate to the site in terms of the climate, which is becoming more important with climate change. But one of the first things I do if I go to a country that I'm not a fay with is I go to their botanic gardens, or I go visit nurseries, or I go, to some public gardens and just see what is growing there. But, in Melbourne, we're very lucky because we can almost grow anything from around the world. You can grow subtropical things, you can grow arid loving things, you can grow anything English. So I've been exposed to this very wide spectrum of planting. And so we have great knowledge of plants in Melbourne. But yeah, I think probably if you go to a new site, just go to a public garden and see what's growing, or in other people's gardens and see what's growing. It's terribly important.
And can we get to topiary, of course? How much topiary do you normally use in your gardens?
Well, I used to use a lot. It's sort of become a little unfashionable now, except for, as I said before, we love using hedges as a backdrop to create the architecture of the garden. We still do that. But if I'm using topiary now, it tends to be like a whimsical element in the garden. So, a little bit of fun. So not masses of pots of topiary, but, one whimsical sort of odd organic shape within a garden bed. So if that's sitting in the middle of a lovely flowering herbaceous border, I think that adds a lot of excitement and interest to it. The other one that, of course, is a bit everyone's using is clouding. So we still use a lot of clouding, and I use that to sort of define edges to axes, to create interest around an ornament in the garden, to create like a walk in the garden. We use a lot of clouding, and that's sort of a very large part of our design now.
In a few moments, going to see some of your own garden at Stonefields, but you've got a lot of topiary in that, haven't you?
I have.
You have.
So I created that 16 years ago. My kids, you always want to evolve and you always want to change, but this garden went in and it's quite mature now, and sort of to pull anything out that's been in there a long time is very difficult to do, and I just can't bring myself to do it. So really, the only way I can keep moving and keep developing there is to expand the garden. So sadly, the garden just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the core of the garden is still very much what it was like 16 years ago, when we were using a lot of formality and a lot of clip topiary.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier on some of your influences. Could you go through them in a bit more detail? Who among garden designers do you think has been the most influential in your career?
Definitely Russell Page. I was very heavily influenced by Russell Page when I was young, and I read The Education of the Garden. I think if anyone has not read that book, it's sort of the quintessential book to read if you're a budding young garden designer, or even just wanting to do your own garden. So Russell Page, I just adored his gardens. I thought they were amazing. And today I was invited like 5 or 6 years ago to sit on the Russell Page Archive Council, which is based in the Garden History Museum in London there. And so, it's a great honor because we get to go around and look at Russell Page's gardens every year and see the ones that you can't get into. So, my sort of childhood dream has turned into this wonderful reality in later life. And I just adored his garden. So that he was definitely a big influence for me when I was young. And then I was very lucky. I became great friends with David Hicks, your English designer. He was probably the most influential inspiration for me. when I was sort of in my 20s and 30s. So we became great friends, and he came to Australia every year and I'd take him around and show him gardens. I'd go to England every year and he'd take me around and we'd look at gardens together. And I learned so much from that man. I mean, his talent was just endless. And, you know, so much about probably what you were talking about before, architecture. The way he brought architecture out into the garden is probably, you know, I'm still doing that today from what I learned from him all those years ago.
That's excellent. The other thing, the thing I'd like to move on to, I will come back to design, but just to talk about the designer-client relationship.
Yeah.
How do you approach that? Because Russell Page actually said the one thing you cannot change when he comes to design a garden, and that is the owner.
Yeah. Look, I think, and you can do this when you're sort of a bit later in your career, is when you go to look at a new job and meet a new client, I think it's very important you know you're going to get on with that client. And usually I develop quite close relationships with my client, because I think the way the client lives their life, their personality should be really largely reflected in the garden you design for them. Like, I don't believe you come in and put your stamp on a garden and then just come away from that garden and leave it like that. I like to interact with the clients a lot. And if I don't get a good feeling from a client, then we don't take the job. So it's very important in that first, like they're interviewing me and I'm interviewing them. So that you know you're going to get along. You know that the way they live is going to be the way you want to design a garden. So that it's a very critical relationship, that client designer relationship. And, you know, I've got clients that I've had for 30 years that just keep coming back every now and then wanting to create new gardens. So I create very long-term relationships with clients. More so than architects and interior designers, I think.
Fernando Carrancho said he interviews his clients before he will take on a job. I mean, have you sort of come to that? You've just hinted at that.
Not quite, but I'd love to get to that. Sometimes when you have a big design office, you have to take a few jobs to keep the wheels turning of the business. But no, it's if we don't get along with a client, we don't do the job. So I think it's very important.
That's fair enough. I mean, what would you turn down if somebody wanted a multicolored borders all around their house? Would that put you off?
Well, no, I think we would turn it down if they weren't passionate about the garden. A lot of people feel a garden is just a necessary thing you have to have. Like, you've built a new house, you have to have a new garden, you know, and they have no idea about gardens, or they're not passionate about them at all. So we'd like people to have an appreciation of plants, whether it's big or small, but still to be able to appreciate them. They don't have to have a great knowledge, but you want people who are going to be engaged in the process and love the garden afterwards. You certainly don't want people who it's just a box they have to tick to have a new garden. They're the ones we would turn down.
When you've designed it and you've left it, how can you keep tabs on it, as it were? Can you go back and see them?
Yes, we do largely. And I think that's why that relationship between a garden designer and a client is very close and very long term, because gardens need love all the time. So you're constantly having to go back and check and watch it grow and make sure they're clipping it the way that you want to clip it, everything's the height you want to do it. And that is, you know, it takes years and maybe decades to achieve. So I'm always going back to jobs and keeping an eye on them very regularly. But that becomes difficult when you've been doing it for 30 years, because you have such a great sort of database of gardens.
There's also the problem that the original owner dies or moves, or
That's right.
And the new owner will come in and say, I don't really like this, I want something different. Is that built in? Yes.
That definitely happens. It doesn't happen very often. Most people, if they're buying a place with a lovely big garden, probably buy it because they love the garden. But often that does happen. You know, the garden might be 20 years old and they say a bit unfashionable, and they want to pull it out. They may call me back, or they may approach a new designer. It doesn't happen often, but it can.
And the other thing a garden designer has to have, you have to be very practical about your designs, don't you? You work for contractors, you have to know all the practical side of gardening, of garden design.
Yeah, you do. You definitely do. And more so the regulatory side of it now. I mean, very much, you're tied up with councils and authorities about, in Australia, they will tell you, especially here in Sydney, they will tell you, you can't plant hedges because they block people's views. They control the height of plants. They have to approve all the plants you put into a garden. So, the regulatory side of it is I find the most difficult side, because you've got some young planner in an office telling you what to do after all your experience that you've gained over these years. That is difficult, but the practical side is very, very important. And, quite often it's nice creating a garden where there's a head gardener already there, because you can gain that knowledge from the head gardener. How wide they want the paths to get their machinery down, all those sort of things you can get from a head gardener, which is always a great resource.
Have you undertaken many public commissions?
Not really. I mean, I'd love to, but we're known more for domestic work. There's a university in Melbourne called Monash that had they've got a campus in Prato in Italy, and they had the only second green space in Prato, in the middle of Prato. It was an old Renaissance courtyard, and we finished doing that about 5 or 6 years ago, and that is just turned out so successful. And the whole town of Prato's embraced it and have events in there now. I did that. I did the Peace Garden for Melbourne, which the Dalai Lama came out and opened for us, but not too many, public commissions. More, it's far more domestic.
Right. Now, let's talk about Stonefields, which is your own garden. Now, Where is it?
Stonefields is about an hour northwest of Melbourne. So it's up in the highlands, what we call the Central Highlands of Victoria. So very much cold and wet in winter. I think, except for the summers, it's very much like an English climate, in the fact that we go down to a top temperature of 8 or 7 or 8 during winter. We can go -1 or 2 or 3 during the nights. But sadly, in summer, we still go up to 45 or 48 degrees in hot spells. But it has beautiful soil. So it's known for its gardens because it has this volcanic soil, which is 2 or 3 meters deep, drains beautifully. It's very fertile, has that mild climate because of the mountain air. We're about 650 meters above sea level. We get a bit of snow, we get lots of frost, but it's just the perfect place in Victoria to create a garden.
Right. Now, it's actually near a famous Victorian picnic spot, isn't it?
Yes, picnic at Hanging Rock.
There we go. There it is. You're not too far. Well, in Australian terms, you're not too far from there. But
yes, that's not far from us.
Yes, that's right. Now, if we come closer to you, we get this as a kind of landscape, don't we?
That's it, yes. So funny enough, that is like when you go down to the lower parts of the road, you get these sort of gum trees, which indicate bad soil. When you get back up to mine, we'll probably see some, but you get the lovely big ash trees, and they denote sort of better soil. But this is very close to me, yes.
Now, that is the view from your garden in actual fact.
That's right. So you'll see on the left-hand side those lovely big old majestic gum trees. They're like 500 or 600 years old, and they are the really big majestic gums that denote beautiful soil.
Right. And what are the other trees we're looking at? Are they all gums?
So they're all gums. This is the reason why Australia burns so easily in bushfires, because that is all gum trees you are looking at. They're full of oil, combustible oil. So one flame gets in there and the whole lot goes up in flames.
But they look as if they could be oaks. They could be anything in England. That could be southern England, actually. It's the Cotswolds or somewhere. It's
that's why I love it.
Yes.
They have a lovely sort of 18th century tree form to them when they're big and old. I love them.
Yes,
yeah.
They are. They're fantastic. Now, this is your garden at Stonefields. Could you just briefly guide us around it? What are we looking at there? So
that's, where the blossom trees are in the front, they're Malus floribunda. Great trees, and they're looking, the garden looks exactly like that now. This is probably the same time of the year, a few years ago we photographed it. So, the cars come in, that's the sort of gravel forecourt in the front with the cars park. And the funny thing is, in my last house, I had a big gravel forecourt right in front of the house where people would normally put it. But not many of my friends appreciate gardens, so they would drive straight to the front door, go in the house and not walk through the garden. So this time I thought I'd put the car park at the top and force them to walk through the garden and experience the garden as they go down. So, you know, you come through from the car forecourt, you come into this little tiny constricted space, which I call my ante-room to the garden. Very simple. It's just got one big box ball sitting in the middle and jets of water coming out of that box ball into a little pond. And that's really all it is. And so it's very simple. And you come from a long drive and you come into this very simple space, and it creates this level of anticipation. And there's a little window in the hedge beyond that where you get a glimpse of the house. So you've got anticipation to see the house and to go on to the next room. And then you come through into that lovely big border of plants. There's 4 beds there with blue flowering perennials in them and edged in the box hedging. And then to the left of that is our white garden with the bleached hornbeams. And then to the right of that is the rose garden. Then you come down the path to the big parterres. There's four beds of very large clip box parterres. And then you arrive at the house.
Excellent. And you planted everything we see here, because this was just a virgin site, wasn't it?
That's right. It was completely devoid, except for the big gum trees on the right and the far left. It was just a cow paddock. So it had nothing but the beautiful soil. So everything you see there is probably about 12 or 13 years old.
Fantastic. Now, this is your house. Now, who designed that?
I did. So this is where the frustrated architect comes from. So, you know, because it was my own, I was able to design that. So yeah, I designed the house as well as the garden. So there's wonderful synergy when you can create the house and the garden together. You know, every room in that house has a view to the garden or the view down the valley. So very special house because it's so connected back to the garden.
Now, if we go behind the house, as it were, from where we are now, this is what we see.
That's right.
And this is a fantastic box parterre. It's really sensational.
It is. Yeah. So, you know, we're blessed in Australia. We were talking about it before. We don't have the caterpillar and we don't have box blight. We have a mite now. I don't know whether you have that in the UK, but we have a mite that actually attacks the box and weakens the plants. And unless you treat it, it will actually kill the plants over about 3 or 4 years. But we have predatory mites that we can buy, and we release those every spring, and they eat all the bad mites in there. So we're very lucky because we have very healthy box, and I've got good soil. It's Buxa sempervirens, so it's the English box. And so those parterres are probably like 10 or 12 years old. I know it's a lot of work to keep it looking like that. They're enormous. And at the moment, I don't know whether you got a photograph, but they're full of white tulips at the moment. So we plant.
No, I was just about to ask you that. In these spaces we see here, we see the soil. That's tulips.
That's tulips. So yes. You know, I planted this garden up, and it developed into this lovely shape and form quite fast. But I didn't like the negative space so much. So I thought, what can I plant in there that's not going to affect the box? Because if you plant something that's in there too long, it'll start to weaken the sides of the box with light. So we planted tulips, and they've just been fantastic. So we have about 12,000 white tulips in there at the moment flowering.
Right. And just to point out, there's a piece of architecture there is your Italianate bell tower in the background of that shot.
That's right. I mean, the house is loosely based on an Italian hillside villa. I mean, I love the way the Italians perch their houses on the side of precipices like we've got there. And so very contemporary version, very sort of simplified version of Italian villa. So I thought if I wanted to create a viewpoint in the herb garden, what could I create? And I thought this bell tower, like you're part of an Italian village, would be a great feature.
Excellent. Now, I thought this was yew. Now, you've just told us, of course, that you can't grow yew in Australia. So what is this we're looking at?
So this, I worked in the Hamptons quite a bit, and this is privet, which they use in the Hamptons all the time. Yew doesn't grow in Australia. It's too hot in Australia for yew, sadly, because I would have loved to have used yew. But this is privet, Ligustrum vulgaris. So great hedge, and it's the hedge they use everywhere in New York and the Hamptons. It's good because it takes snow, frost, heat, drought, anything you throw at it, it will tolerate. It cuts like butter, so they love it because you can cut into old wood and it'll regenerate. You can do anything with this. It's very soft and easy to cut. The downside is it needs pruning a lot. So the gardeners prune this about 6 times a year to keep the shape.
Really, I'm not certain I've seen this as a hedge in England, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, you use a slightly different type of privet in England. It's got a bigger leaf. This is a much finer leaf. It's actually a great hedging plant.
And this is
Really.
the circle to look through as you approach the garden from that column.
That's right. So you come
Yes,
out of the car and you come to that little space we spoke about before, and you look through this window towards the house, and you can see the
yes.
house through that window.
And this is jumping outside the garden proper, and you've got 4 layers here of hedging in effect, haven't
Yeah,
you?
I have, yeah. So this is one of the areas that I keep adding on to. This is probably like 6 or 7 years old. So this is part of the expansion process. But they're English box balls again. I call this our caterpillar hedge. It sort of winds its way down the hill along the side of the garden, and sort of you can see the influence of softening with the meandering edge to it and the softer edge. Then Rosa rugosa alba behind that, the privet as the main architecture to the walls of the garden, and then pleached hornbeams behind that. Yeah, so 4 layers.
And this is coming a little bit further back and more architecture. You've got 2 of these circular pavilions either side of the garden.
Yeah, so they form part of the apple walk. They're the focal points for our apple walk. When you get into the garden, you look back along the apple walk and the clouds of box to these little pavilions. So I wanted focal points at the end of the apple walk, but I wanted them to be practical. I wanted you to be able to use them. So, each of them has a table and chairs in there, and we can sit in each one according to the time of the day or the time of the year. This one looks out to our lovely home paddock or our field. The other one looks out to the big, magnificent gum trees. So they're fantastic focal points because they're practical. We can use them as well. The interesting thing is we use the slate horizontally on the roof. So it's actually got stacked slate as it goes up to form the cone. So I think there's like 2 tons of stone sitting on top of that little pavilion.
Amazing. Do you know how many of these box balls you have in total?
Yeah, I think the gardener says we're up to about 420.
Good heavens. And how many men cut it?
2.
2.
Yeah, we have 2 full-time gardeners, and they seem to get through it. So they're very
incredible.
They're great gardeners, and they're great workers.
And there it is in containers near the house.
Yeah. So that's at the back that's sort of to the side of the house, and I wanted this collection of box balls. So that's the view down the apple walk, looking to those pavilions. That's looking to the one that looks out to the lovely big old gum trees.
Excellent.
But these box balls have been in for about 10 or 12 years now, and we bought them quite big, but they've just created this lovely sort of form as they wind down towards the pavilions. And they're fruiting apples. We get beautiful, deep red, crisp apples from them.
And this is the central rill.
Yeah, so that's the central spine of the garden. That's, once you've looked through that little circle in the hedge, you come into this space, and they're the perennial beds that we spoke about. They're predominantly blue, with lots of blue flowering perennials in them. There's lots of agastaches, eupatoriums, and asters in there, but it's just full. And we manage that. They love our area, the flowering perennials. We get them flowering from October right through to late April. Yeah, so the rill was, it really defines the main axes of the garden and lines up with the column behind the obelisk where we've got our wedge-tailed eagle sitting on the top. So I tried to use as many of our local animals as possible as inspiration for the ornaments in the garden. And, trying to think of something that would squirt water and look good was quite difficult. We've got platypus, we've got wombats, we've got echidnas, but none of them sort of felt right. So we came up with a snake. And a lot of people don't like the snakes.
That's obviously looking back again to the house and the box part here. Now, if we go to the other side of the house, we get something, I have to say it, which is completely different. Well, that's the wide shot. That just shows the whole of all of the parterres. It's been 4 groups there, isn't it?
Yeah, and the parterres are just very simple parterres. Yeah, and so when you walk through the house, the rill lines up with the pool, and you come out to the back of the house, and there's the pool, and it sort of shows you the view of the valley. It was very important that I got this feeling of that main lawn floating in the valley space. So when you're inside the house, you can't see the immediate foreground. You just see this crisp edge of the lawn and the valley below that.
And it looks like an infinity lawn, if I can call it that, because actually beneath that we have this.
So we have the blue perennials. They came later. It used to be just the Finity edge was the very edge of the garden. And it was wonderful because it meant the garden really did hang in the air of the valley. But I get frustrated, I keep adding more. And so this garden came about 8 years ago. And it's just full of all different shades of blue flowering perennials.
Now, your grass there is incredibly fine. We
It
can't
is.
see that on this photograph, but I've never seen any grass of that
Well,
thinness,
you would have,
fineness, but it's incredible. What is it?
it's
Type of
creeping
grass?
bent grass, creeping bent. So it's what golf courses use on their putting greens.
Ah,
Yeah, a lot of work.
a
I wouldn't
lot of
recommend it.
work.
Yeah, a lot of work. A lot of work. My head gardener is a mad turf person.
And he told me you were going to actually replace it again, and I thought it's incredible. I've never seen such a good lawn. But anyway, we won't talk about it because we can't appreciate it unless you walk on it. Now, here's some of your planting, and that doesn't look like a Paul Bangay garden.
I told you I'd in
Yes,
old age. So yeah, lots of flowers. You know, it's very important now that you get some formality with the backdrop of the hedges and maybe some clouding in the garden, but lots and lots of flowers. Everybody wants flowers now. Everyone wants softness. And so, yeah, this is the herbaceous borders either side of the pool. The color scheme very much reflects what happens in the distant view. So you can see the distant view of the hills. In Australia, it always browns off in the summer. So very much these sort of burnt oranges and browns and yellows. So it reflects what's happening in the distant view.
and that's one of your borders to the side of the lawn.
Yeah, yeah, lots of heleniums, lots of Calabagrossi, the lovely clematis up on this. Yeah, so here's the white garden. So when I was very young, I was very much inspired by Sissinghurst. I think everybody is, and the white garden at Sissinghurst. So I always wanted my own white garden, and finally I got one when I created it here. And so it's just full of white perennials. It's got the hornbeams around the edge because we're quite windy. Being at 650 meters, we're quite windy. So the hornbeams give us an extra layer of protection from the wind for these rooms. And underneath that, we've planted lots of white flowering perennials and white water lilies in the pond.
Excellent.
And these 4 trees in the corners are Malus spectabilis, which is the whitest of the crabapples.
Right. And this...
It's woodland. So then I wanted a woodland. So I created this garden in the middle of a paddock, which had no shade. And all I wanted was shade and coolness and woodland plants. So we planted this woodland to the side of the house. This came a lot later. It's full of sugar maples and pin oaks to give us the shade we wanted. And then I was able now to create all these sort of wonderful soft woodland plantings underneath. It's great on a hot summer's day here, like very cool on a hot summer's day.
Excellent. This is part of your rose garden.
Yeah, that's part of the rose garden. So when I was creating the rose garden, I just got back from Iran and seen the beautiful rose gardens in Shiraz. And their rose gardens are very much like you think a Persian rug would be, with the sort of deep maroons and purples and sort of warm colors, as opposed to light pinks and whites. So, you know, I was very heavily influenced by the gardens of Iran when I did this garden. So we've got Gertrude Jekyll as the main rose, lots of red dahlias, anthriscus, lilies that give us the deep red, columbines with deep red, and the deep red rugosa rose on the side there, and Angelica gigas. So all very much about these deep burnt colours.
Thank you. And what's behind this hedge?
The vegetable garden.
The vegetable garden, right.
Yeah.
And what is the hedge?
The hedge is cypress. It's Leighton's green, the dreaded Leighton's green, but it's
Right.
very robust. And
Yes.
it's very tall, so we needed that wind protection to the
Right.
vegetable garden fast.
And there is at Stonefields a second garden, isn't there? Which is here.
Yeah. So we bought the house next door and the farm next door, and that gave us more land, which was great. But it came with a house. We didn't know what to do with it, so we've turned it into a B&B, and it's been very successful because people stay there. It's got 4 bedrooms, and then they get to come over and see our garden. They can wander around our garden. So it's very important for people to be able to come and stay and have that experience. And we just hear very simple, just the herbaceous perennials, and then these organic shapes of green just sitting dotted through those garden beds. And you can see the wonderful ring of big old gums behind them. They're like 500 or 600-year-old gum trees. So beautiful, really beautiful trees. Yeah, it's just full of flowering perennials. People love it because they can sit there and be immersed in all this color and flower material. Doesn't have the spectacular view that we have, sadly. It's sort of, ringed by these trees and doesn't look down the valley as much as the main house does.
No, but that's excellent. And I hope everybody notes if they want to go and see Stonefields, then they can come and hire your farmhouse there.
I can.
They can, yes, it's fantastic. I see we're getting short on our time, but I just need to come to your books. I think you produced the first one in 1996, is that right?
Yeah,
It was
I
a
did.
Defined Garden?
Yes, I did. And David Hicks he kindly wrote the foreword for that book. He was still alive back then. It's been a great honor to be able to write books. I had a publisher approach me from Penguin, and we've become great friends, and she's been my publisher for a long, long time now. And every 2 years we bring out, pretty well every 2 to 3 years, we bring out a new book. And writing books, I just find is one of the greatest joys in life. I just love that.
And you have produced, well, I've got 14 books that you have produced. You may have even more that I've missed some.
That's the right count, yeah.
Right, that's amazing. And you do indeed have another one coming out very shortly. I don't know if it's out in Australia.
I do. I've got it here.
There it is. Fantastic.
It comes out in November in Australia.
You're right. It's November the 3rd. It's available in the UK.
It's Stonefields by the Season. So the first book on Stonefields, which I did a long time ago, really showed a garden that was immature. So I thought it was good to come back and revisit it when it was actually mature. So now every photograph you get in there is of a mature garden. And it just tells people how to live a garden through the season. So it talks about what's out in flower in the garden in that particular season, what activities to do in the garden in that season, and what activities to do to prepare for future seasons in the garden. So it's a very seasonal book.
Now I've got a highly loaded question, but you say in your latest book, a truly great garden should enrich your soul and those of many others, and hopefully for generations to come. And you reflect on the rich meaning of gardens and the rewards of gardening. Now, we need a whole day to talk about that, but what is a garden for when we talk about more on the spiritual side?
I think, I'm sure you've experienced this. When you walk around a great garden, it doesn't have to be a big garden, it doesn't have to be a grand garden, but when you walk around a great garden and you really experience that garden and it's something of intense beauty, that feeling that brings to you, and it's been beautifully designed, it's got all the right ingredients of a great garden. What that does to your soul is just something you can't really define. And it's the essence of a great garden. And to be able to get that and put it into a new garden is one of the hardest things in the world to do. Like, I just think a garden should have a wonderful soul. It takes a little while to get that soul, but, and that's where we go back to that client designer relationship, because a lot of that soul will come from a very passionate owner.
That's really excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'd like to hand back to Chris, who's now going to bring in other questions for you, Paul.
I have privet in my front garden. It's the boring British type of privet. Do you have problem with privet dieback, where it just decides to go ugh, and you get a brown patch and then there's nothing can be done with it? Or is the Australian privet better?
I think the Australian privet is slightly better. It's not, it's not highly regarded in Australia like it's not highly regarded in England as well. It's a bit sort of a common sort of hedge to use. But it was great for us to use up where we are. Funny enough, we had one tiny little bit of privet dieback in it, and I'd never seen it before, and I panicked and thought all our hedges were going to die. We fertilized them well, we watered them well, and they've tended to grow out of it now. But there was a moment of great panic when I saw that and couldn't work out what was going on.
I can imagine. Okay, questions. Stick your hands up if you've got a question for Paul. Louise.
This is a bit of I don't know if you can help at all, but I'm basically trained to be a designer. I'm really, really early days with it. And I've managed to work in an estate, and it's an awesome. And they've tasked me with designing a topiary garden. Yeah. I've never designed one before, and I'm doing lots and lots of research at the moment. But I've been shown the place they want to put it today, and obviously when you think of a topiary garden, you think of symmetry. Well, I'm topiary obviously, but it's a very odd angled kind of shaped area that isn't like a square box, or it's not got an obvious kind of line to work to. I just wondered if you've had that sort of challenge before, and any advice you'd give on how you might create. Yeah.
Often when they're an odd shape, I mean, and you've got to go back and see what their definition of a topiary garden is really, because often when you have a very sort of difficult shape, you're better with more organic forms. Yeah. Like you're better with more organic shapes because it's more forgiving in terms of the layout of the garden. So it may be you can do it with sort of more clouding than geometric sort of, you know, tears or clip straight lines of box or something like that. So go back to them and say, you know, do you mind if this is slightly more contemporary? It could be, you know, softer with clouding and in different, sort of more organic form to the garden bed, because that really does overcome difficult shapes.
Okay, thank you.
I'm slightly surprised it only took 2 days for your guys to clip all the 420 box balls.
Oh no, they take more than 2 days. They take 2 men. They've started clipping now, and they say it's like painting the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Like as soon as you're finished, you have to go back and do it again. So from October right through till like February, when the garden slows down, they're clipping constantly.
I must have misheard that, because I was thinking, blimey, they're quick.
No, they're not. They're very accurate, but they're not that. Yeah, well, they're quite fast, but it does take a while.
Say.
Yeah.
Could I ask, what are your 5 favourite or more perennials to grow here in Melbourne?
So in Melbourne, all the agastaches, I think, are just fabulous. The agastache sweet lily, the agastache blue boa, blue fortune, you know, they're just like the best perennials to grow. They flower and flower and flower and flower, you know, non-stop. Eupatoriums, I love eupatoriums. They don't do so well in Melbourne. They do better up around us. And the salvias, like the salvias, there's so many great salvias that reward you with lots of flowers, especially in Melbourne.
I have to thank you for recommending the agastache and the salvias. I think they've taken over my garden, but they bring such beauty and joy, colour. It's wonderful in the hot summer.
What gardens in the UK have you done?
I haven't, and we didn't talk about this. I don't know whether Roger knows this, but we've bought a little house in the UK.
Yeah, whereabouts? Are we allowed to ask?
Just out in the Cotswolds near Cirencester, in a little village called Duntersbourne Abbots. And it's always been my dream to have a house in the English countryside. And 18 months ago, 2 years ago, we bought this little cottage, and it's just been the greatest joy, except for now, because we can't get there. The Australian government is not letting anyone leave the country. And they're saying probably we haven't been able to leave all this year. We're probably not going to be able to leave all next year. So it's probably going to be 2 years until I see this garden that we've been putting in remotely. So last winter, we planted these wonderful U shapes that we bought from Belgium. The perennials have just gone in. We've paved it. We've just created all the spaces, and I haven't been there to see any of it. It's just so sad.
So I did know about it, Paul. That's true. But who's looking after it when you can't get there?
So we have a wonderful girl who caretakes it for us, and we've got a wonderful gardener. And the wonderful thing about it is, like, Stonefields is like 15 acres of solid garden, and this is 1/4 of an acre of garden. So it's so manageable. It's just so manageable. It's fantastic. So we get there and we have this gardener. Instead of 2 full-time gardeners, we have this wonderful girl who comes in for 3 hours a week. Like, it's just amazing, 3 hours a week. And she's so passionate. She looks after it. She's in the next village. Everyone keeps an eye on this little house and garden for us. So we're so blessed to have, you know, that wonderful village feeling where everyone's looking after you. But we're just desperate to get there. We can't get there.
Absolutely. Does she send you photographs of it?
Yes.
So you can, yes.
We get lots of photographs, lots of videos. You know, every time the cleaner goes in, we ask for a video. Every time the gardener goes, we ask for videos too. So we're living very digitally through this garden at the moment.
How very frustrating for you. But you've got lots of EBTS members in and around that area, so you're in good company.
Area, and our little village is like a forgotten part of the Cotswolds. It's like no through traffic. I was shocked when we first spent the first couple of days there. There's 4 horses go past the front gate for every 1 car. That's the ratio I've come up with.
Well, I think we're coming to the end, are we, Chris?
If there's any more questions, raise your hand.
Just a quick question. I noticed your lovely box balls that you've got in pots, and I always find it difficult to keep them looking good in pots. What's your regime for them? How do you keep them looking so healthy?
I think it's probably feeding. Like, you know, we don't seem to have problems with them growing them in the pots. You know, I think having the right size pot might, you know, if you need a decent volume of soil for them. So if they're in too smaller pots, sometimes they suffer. But those pots, we've got them in a quite large, and we feed them every year. You know, we give them a good feed of dynamic lifter, which is like concentrated chicken pellets, manure pellets here. So we just feed them with those, a bit of liquid fertilizer. And they seem to thrive. So we don't seem to have problems with them in pots here. I think it's probably more about getting the right size pot.
I was going to say, it is a key thing with box because its roots grow out sideways, that you need to give it a larger pot than you would maybe normally think. Louise, did you have another question? No? Okay. Mark Hopkins, our former chairman.
You speak of all your wonderful gardens and all your wonderful successes, for which I applaud you. Have you had any disasters?
Of course not, Mark.
Luckily, I haven't had any disasters with clients yet. They always threaten me if there's a disaster, I'll be in trouble. But no great disasters there. I mean, I think with Stonefields, I'm able to experiment with plants that may or may not work. Because it's your own garden, so we might have had a few disasters there, but no great disasters that I can recall. Thank goodness.
I'm delighted to hear that.
I'd just like to mention your book again. It's called Stonefields by the Seasons, and it's available from November the 3rd. It seems worldwide now, and I think it can be done in the UK for about £30. It's wonderfully illustrated all the way through, isn't it?
It is. I've had the same photographer ever since I started doing books, Simon Griffiths, and he lives nearby me in the country, and he comes every week and photographs the garden. So his photography is just amazing in the book.
Yes, and could I put in a request for a future book? And that is, could we at some stage have your designs published?
Oh,
or is that giving it away to your rival? But I think eventually it would be very interesting to see the ground plans and see the designs and how you achieved your great success.
That would be a good idea. I'll put that one to the publishers. Funny enough, we have a lot of clients who don't want their name mentioned or don't want plans shared anywhere. And so on the title for those plans, we always have to put their dog's name. So that I go back and look at these plans and think, I don't remember that client. And then I remember it's actually the dog's name that appears on the plan.
Thank you very much. We could go on and on, actually. There's so many garden questions to ask, but it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely.
And thank you very much indeed. And a very good morning to you, Paul.
And good evening to all of you.
Thank you.